Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Matt Greco, the events manager at PSS Life University. And today we have Dina D'Alessandro, our regular monthly presenter, registered dietitian, always on some interesting food-related topics and diet-related topics. And today she's got one for all ages, but I'll hand it over to Dina and let her explain more about this.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me again. It's nice to see you, even though I can't see you. It's nice to see you. September is Healthy Aging Month, so I thought what a great opportunity to include information about what is quote unquote known as healthy aging and the fact that, all of you are in the senior population, so this fits appropriately. And also to share with you, if you may or may not have heard about these global places called the blue zones. So I'll share a little bit more about that in the slides that have progressed. And of course, let's get started with just some of the takeaways that I hope you find interesting when you're watching this presentation about learning the common lifestyle factors just that contribute in general to what helps us get older, how we can maintain longevity in our lives. And also we'll talk about the communities of the blue zone, specifically some of what their factors are that come across helping them also maintain their longevity. And we will focus about the social well-being and then maybe diving a little deeper as I share this information with you. At the end of these webinars, I always ask you to see what you can take away, how you might be able to apply some of what we've learned, what I'm sharing with you in your own lives. Housekeeping as usual, the session is being recorded as you came in. You heard that announcement. You can use the chat box at any time. Matthew and I usually moderate, and of course, I'll stop every few slides or so. And there's also a Q&A option here too. So if you have any questions coming up that are related or even not related to what I'm talking about, I'll make sure I try to field those, but we'll also have some time. I usually try to end around like the 45 minute mark, so we have some time for proper Q&A if I can't get to it during the course of the presentation. I've told you once, I've told you again, I ain't your doctor, I ain't your registered dietitian, so please make sure you're checking with your own personal healthcare professionals for whatever you need, whatever changes you plan to make in your own lifestyle choices, medicines, etc., because this is not to be considered medical advice. It's just entertainment, information, education for you. If we've never met before, hello, my name is Dina D'Alessandro. I am a registered dietitian nutritionist. I also am an adjunct lecturer up in the Bronx at Lehman College, where I teach undergraduate and graduate nutrition courses, and I'm also the campus dietitian there. So I get a wide variety of people with whom I cross paths with, and I gain experiences from all of the conversations I have and the relationships that I make, whether it's cultural, generational, age-related. So I'm so, so grateful for every opportunity that comes my way to make me a better dietitian. And I also get to work with a lot of the students and interns that are coming up through the ranks of their curriculum to help them with their next stages of their career development too. So that always makes me feel really good because these are my future colleagues that I get to work with too. All right, so I'm going to start with just sharing some fast facts and how we define longevity, right? So longevity is the length of time that we are on this planet. And also we'll talk a little bit too, because I think a lot of times when we talk about healthcare and health outcomes, and I've mentioned this in some of the past webinars, we place a lot of emphasis and responsibility on the individual person, but I definitely want to alleviate that from you. I want to recognize and acknowledge that it's not always what the things that you can do, but what's going on around you and the access that you might have to things and why you make the choices that you do. So as you can see on screen here, we start off with just basic quality healthcare. Access to high quality healthcare, the doctors that you need, health insurance, whatever you have available location wise or affordability. We also have genetics play a role. Absolutely. But we've also, I think in some of the past discussions, we've shared that you can definitely overcome some of the risk factors that have to do with your familial patterns or history, but we try to take into consideration as to what might affect that and how that might affect your outcomes too. We also look at your environment. So, environment can be things like smoking or sunburns or living next to, a factory that's spewing out pollution. And then we also have things like lifestyle factors. So, this is a good time too, if you feel like you want to share a little bit about, what focuses you're looking at, how you define longevity, what are your concerns. You can put that in the chat if you want to. And I'll share a little bit of like the examples of what a lifestyle factor is. So, yes, diet plays a huge role in the food choices we make, both quality and quantity. We're going to have a lot of conversation about that in the slides to come. Physical activity, moving can also improve health outcomes too. But things that can take away are things like substance use and abuse, poor sleep habits, and also how we manage our mental health. So not just in the sense of cognitive decline as we age, but also how we're dealing with stressful factors. Because if you remember that whole discussion around inflammation from a couple of webinars ago, things that rely in our bodies in a chronic way, in a chronic state, right? Stress sometimes is okay, like, oh, I'm scared, I got to run away from something in danger. That's fine. That's an acute situation. But the stress that we put on ourselves through financial situations, relationship issues, whatever, in other things that are existing in your life, that can play a role on our cellular level, on our bodies too. And we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up as well. All right, I'm going to give you some stats, the good, the bad, and the ugly with all this stuff. Currently, as of a couple of years ago, our life expectancy is almost twice as much as it was 200 years ago. So thank you. Positive and negatively, we can kind of dissect this, but thank you, science and technology, things like sanitation and vaccinations and environmental protections, I think have led us to live a little bit longer lives than we used to. But unfun fact, this is actually a little bit less than what we saw in statistics in 2019. So COVID taken in that into effect, and also any COVID related illnesses that have taken place since then brought us down a few years. So we were actually bumping up right around 78 to 79 years of age in 2019, and now we're back down to 76. So hopefully we'll get back to where we need to be with some of the things that we can in our society systems, et cetera, that can help us live a little bit longer than and get us back up to that 78-year mark. Just as a comparison, I don't have that here on the slide, but Africa is 61 years of age, India is 67. So again, taking into consideration things that you just saw in that previous slide and things that I'm going to share with you shortly as to why are some of the places in the globe living a lot longer, and why are some of the places around the globe not living as long. So we'll see that too. Okay, I don't love this image because you can't see the little notes on the side, but that's totally fine. If you can see the gradation of the colors, this is kind of just sharing a typical American life in week by week form. So wherever you happen to be on here, not to make it like, oh, shoot, look how little I have left, but also to acknowledge and recognize how far you've come. All of the things that have provided you with experiences in your early years, any kind of school experiences you had, where you made friends or classmates, or how you started working, and the relationships you made there too. Maybe that's when you got married. Maybe that's when you got promoted to do something and took on a larger role. Maybe that's when you started traveling more because you didn't have to worry about student loans. And so just kind of taking a look at, that short portion up top is generally speaking of when we're all going to school. And then that red section is we're clocking in a lot of hours doing work stuff in our professional years. And, maybe even right now, you're still working in some capacity. And then the quote unquote retirement years, not everybody looks at the retirement years as favorably. Maybe you're not getting what you were hoping to get out of life, or maybe you liked being busy and around people too. So maybe the retirement years aren't something that you feel is a positive thing. But I just thought this captured the at a glance of, how precious every week is. I mean, some of us might not have made it past a certain time, and people that we know in our lives might not have made it past a certain time. Of course, accidents, tragic experiences can happen that shorten our lives in general. But in an ideal world, if everything was what we needed to for it to be, and that we were able to make choices that we could make to help us, that this would be kind of the way to go. So I thought that was a cool image to share with you. So let's also talk a little bit too about this definition of health. And I crack up every time because in my classes, I teach life cycle nutrition. So I always start with asking students, and for you as well, if you want to put in the chat or talk amongst yourselves, or just, kind of process the question I'm about to ask, what is health? How do you define health? And when my students, the words that they used, I shared with you on the slide here, are just as vague as the word health. We can't really say health equals the following things, or that health is the absence of all the things, because it really does a disservice, right? Just generally speaking, that maybe I am living with a physical, mental disability, or I do have chronic conditions that I'm managing, but I'm still enjoying my life. I still have a positive outlook on things. So the language that was used here, like the well-being, the vitality, active lifestyle, clarity, and all of the things that go along with it are very individualized factors, are very individualized factors. So think about the language that you use about what makes you feel healthy, what you think health is, and how you might define that for yourself. I've shared this image with you in some previous webinars because I always think this is important to acknowledge that regardless of what we do, and as I mentioned before, with that 51% of our factors that help with longevity being lifestyle factors, we can only do so much as an individual if we do not have the things that you see on screen here. If we're being challenged because we don't have access to certain things that provide us with healthy outcomes, like economic stability, like a social context, education, etc. So these are what are known as the social determinants of health, and they really do play a role no matter what topic we're going to be discussing, because we can't keep saying, hey, it's up to you to make these choices. It's really what you have access to, what is challenging. And so here I'm going to just for a tiny bit just have a little PSA, right? This is where I do encourage you to know, recognize, research a little bit more about policies and programs that are in place. I ask you to advocate because especially it's an election year right now, but anytime you have a community board member going up to be reelected or a representative that's running again, take a look at some of the history of what they vote for or don't vote for, and is it in alignment with what your values are? And can you see where things might break down in the system? That this is why it's not always your responsibility to make things happen, because sometimes things are just not structured in a way to support you. So I just want to share that with you to make sure we're all doing our part to advocate and support each other, especially on a more systemic level. So here I'm going to share with you how we define old age in America and across the globe, depending on different programs and accessibility to things or recommendations of things. We start out about 60 years old, and that becomes the older adult population. Just in comparison, pediatrics, right? So pediatric population is 0 to 20. So when we're looking at the health growth charts that we use to document the trajectory of a child as they progress through their younger years of life, this takes us from 0 to 2 and then from 2 to 20. So about 20 years old to 60 years old is what we call young adult to adult ages, and then 60 and above is how we define the older adult population. So whether you are qualifying for the Older American Act Nutrition Program or Medicare, that's how they use that criteria. Census bureaus use a different number for 65 and older. They also subcategorize sometimes in categories there too. And then in my world, the dietary reference intakes of what the recommendations are for what your needs are, both in the quantity and the quality of your food, that changes over when you hit 70 years old. So now we take different things into account as to what is progressing in an older adult and how we can help maintain and manage your health in that way as far as food is concerned. All right, nerd out with me. I like getting sciencey in these webinars. So when we talk about things that occur on the cellular level, or that things are being disrupted, or there is a mutation of something, this is basically what we're talking about. My friend who is a genetic counselor explained to me that this whole DNA system we've got going on is kind of like the instruction manual for our body. So think of it in terms of, like a table of contents and then chapters of a book. And this helps us build and maintain our living being, our living organism. This is also why these environmental factors play a role. This is also why food, how we eat and how we ingest, they can actually modify some of these gene expression patterns. They can, and of course, you also have conditions that you can be born with, or you can undergo surgery or an illness or some sort of stress that can also play a role with messing with this. So think of it kind of like as also switches, like things that are turning on and off to make sure that those instructions are moving accordingly in order for our bodies to function. I'm going to share with you in the coming slides something that talks specifically about these little end pieces of the chromosome image that you see. They're called telomeres. So just keep that in your mind for a second. Telomeres at the end of your chromosomes, and you'll see what I'm going to talk about in a sec. So we don't know exactly why or how we age because there's not a one-to-one correlation for every single individual on Earth. Obviously, as I just mentioned, we all have a variety of factors taken into account as to what makes us get older, what ages us. But there are some theories that I'll go into detail here, and they are as follows. The first one is known as the programmed aging. This is basically we're born and the clock starts ticking. It happens, and biologically speaking, it's anybody's guess. Does it happen at 34 years or 54 years or 84 years? Who's to know? But this is just a change and a gradual decline in overall body functions. And again, those little genes that are expressing or turning on and off. And there's a natural process that happens that brings us to the end of our life at whatever time that happens to be. Somewhat similarly, there's also a theory called the molecular clock theory, where we're talking about changes in DNA over the course of time related more towards something called methylation. So if you just remember that picture I showed you, this has to do with those little nubby ends, those little telomeres at the ends of your chromosomes, because changes can disrupt the function of those things and then lead to or put you at risk for some age-related diseases or conditions. And so, in the way that we kind of usurp this, especially when it comes to food and diet, again, if anybody knows any chemistry backgrounds, there's something called a methyl group, CH3, carbon, hydrogen, 3 atoms of that. These are methyl groups. These are all found in your produce items. Your produce items, your foods, your plant-based foods help with creating a methylation. They kind of like donate, they contribute some of that those chemical substances to those little telomeres. So instead of those telomeres wearing away and kind of getting nubby and shortening over the course of our lives, you're actually placing more methyl groups on them by the diet that you're eating. Again, a theory. Okay. Then the last thing on here is called the wear and tear theory. And this is aging process that our bodies are going through just to accumulated damage over time. So we see here this language about harmful factors or environmental stressors. I mentioned sunburns, smoking, living near toxic pollution. This could also be related to something called, living fast and dying young, these thrill seekers, or if you are in a very high stress position, like in finance, right? You're dealing with people's money and stock markets. So all of these things can be considered environmental stressors. And what ends up happening there, as you can see on that word that I highlighted there, cytotoxicity, which just means your cells, they died. They're done. So that is occurring on that cellular level. So again, if you remember that picture I showed you, right, all of these things are taking place and eventually your cells just can't live any longer. And so they're popping off because they are breaking down. So again, a quick little PSA, be be an educated consumer, be conscious about things in the pills and supplement industry, or even in like some of the skincare things where they're promoting anti-aging substances. When we talk about supplements, we're talking about things that are in addition to what you're already being able to do for your own health and wellness. Nothing is going to be a magic pill or a magic cure of damage that is already done. So it's really about helping us establish a better quality environment for us to have access to certain things and give us that support on the cellular level versus trying to make up for it in by taking pills and supplements, etc. They just want your money, so just be an educated consumer when it comes to that. All right, friends, we're going to get to this whole conversation around blue zones. If you're in the chat, near the chat, you feel like give me a thumbs up or a yes, no. Have you heard of the blue zones before? I am very excited to share, because I know a lot of people subscribe to Netflix. There's a 4-part series right now, taking place right now, about the blue zones, and I'll talk a little bit more about who this guy is. I Aside from the research I did with, information that exists in studies and online, I was actually skimming through some of these episodes, and I will tell you something. I ran through the gamut of emotions. I got very upset. I got emotional. I kept thinking like, why can't it be like this everywhere? Why are there only certain places in the globe where people are thriving and living their best lives? And so the blue zones are areas around our planet where people tend to live significantly longer, hitting what is known as the centenarian age, which is 100 years or older, but they're doing so with lower rates of things like chronic disease, lower rates of dementia. And they also tend to have like smooth skin and perfect teeth. So they don't even look like that wear and tear discussion that I was just saying too. So a lot of the things that we can say, oh, that person looks their age, or this is what's aging me, you wouldn't necessarily be able to recognize that. So if you've seen this or you haven't seen it and you have Netflix, take a look. Tell me in a later webinar what you thought about this, because I definitely did a lot of deep diving and I just thought this was fascinating. Dan Buettner, who's the guy that you see here, he's an American author and explorer. His background is in like international business affairs or something. So he's not a researcher, he's not a healthcare provider or professional. He just found it interesting in his travels to learn more about longevity. And so he collected a lot of information over the last 20-ish years or so, and he's termed that as blue zones. So you'll see in the coming slides as we go kind of like on a trip around the world, but then eventually we'll talk a little bit more about the common factors that a lot of these communities represent and have, that he's determining again as a theory as to what he thinks help them live longer. So here at a glance, we have a little bit of everything. Yes, there's even a place in America that is considered a blue zone, which I thought is fascinating, and I'll explain a little bit more about that too. But you have Loma Linda, California, Nicoya, Costa Rica, Sardinia, Italy, Ikaria, Greece, and Okinawa, Japan. Again, if you want to share with me in the chat, if you've been to any of these places, if you are from any of these places, if you're familiar with any of these places, please let me know. I'd love to hear your experience about that. But I'm going to take you on a little trip around the world and give you some insight into some of these specific areas here. So let's start with Loma Linda, California. Again, West Coast. It's actually quite urban, which you'll see in a second. I have some pictures to share with you too, but it's a high concentration of Seventh-day Adventists. So they do have a religious affiliation. If you're not familiar with the SDA, they are a Christian denomination. And the key factors here that we notice with this particular region is diet, lifestyle, and environment. And here are some pictures that I captured from the internet about Loma Linda. So, I mean, like, right, population, high-rise buildings, but also kind of like open air, open space, but also talking about this concentration that they are quite community-based as well. And even though Seventh-day Adventists do promote vegetarianism, so they do focus primarily on vegetarian foods or plant-based foods. They don't exclude meat, like they don't have to exclude meat. So I just shared with you an example of what could be considered a typical meal for them. And there's a piece of chicken in there. But again, you can see it's mostly plant-based, nuts, etc. They also abstain from alcohol, tobacco, substances, etc. And their community does promote more of a holistic approach to healthcare, and they also focus on community building and community service too. So again, keeping this in mind as some of the factors that you might see common across the world. Next up is Nicoya Peninsula. This is in Costa Rica. Fascinatingly, not all of Costa Rica abides by this whole blue zone thing, but this particular area region in Costa Rica does. So again, Pacific coast of Costa Rica, with some of the key factors being focused on diet, lifestyle, and social structure. Costa Rica, or I should say Nicoya Peninsula, actually has about 3 times as many centenarians as the United States does, just to give you an example. But globally speaking, a lot of these other regions are like in the 10 times centenarians in comparison to us. So here are some pictures. Outdoor space, very close to water, but also lush, rich rainforest. So this nature component is in there too, open air, open space. And here's an example of a typical Nicoyan meal. So they have some black beans there, but they also have some meat. They also have some other grains and vegetables, and even eggs are represented in this dish too. Next up, we have Sardinia, Italy. This is a mountainous region in the area of Sardinia. So again, Sardinia's got a lot of other stuff or I should say Italy obviously has a lot of stuff going on around it, but this is a very specific region there. Their key factors are diet, lifestyle, and social structure. Again, looks kind of similar to some of the things you're going to see and have already seen next to the water, open airspace, but also mountains too. And we're going to talk a little bit too about the terrain of a lot of these regions. So here's a typical Sardinian dish. Obviously, they're near water, so they're going to promote a lot of seafood or shellfish. They have grains, they have legumes, right? So there's bread in the background there, and this kind of couscous looking pasta thing in the front. Then we have Icaria, Greece. So this is an island in the Aegean Sea. Key factors: diet, lifestyle, and social engagement. Greece and Italy, geographically speaking, are along the Mediterranean area. So you would think in general, right, they would be healthy all around. But again, this particular region more so, which I'll share with you a little bit more coming up. And I do see something in the chat. So bear with me one sec as I get through these slides, and I'll take a look at the chat. So again, right, a picture of a typical region of this space, very close to the water, but again, tightly knitted community, populated, and also the terrain kind of like uphill, downhill living. This could be a typical Icarian meal. Again, legumes, chickpeas are a real staple there as well. A lot of different flavors, varieties, herbs, and spices are also something that we see in this region too. And then lastly, we have Okinawa, Japan, which is a string of islands in the southern region of Japan. So Japan, kind of goes up like this, and then there's like this little chain of islands, and that is considered Okinawa. Diet, lifestyle, and spirituality are playing a role here. So again, if anybody watched the Netflix special, oh, I just fell in love with the Okinawan family that they showed in the beginning of that clip. They were so, so sweet. So I encourage you, if you get a chance to watch it, please do so. Again, right, obviously islands, so they're they're in the water, but they also have these lush natural spaces too, open air that they can move around, and there's a lot of gardening areas and farmland here too. So this could be an example of a typical Okinawan diet. They do eat tofu. They eat a ton of sweet potato. That is a very kind of like native ingredient to their region, and very plant-based as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Okay, give me a sec. Let me just take a look at the chat to see if I can. Yeah, look like chickpeas. Exactly, exactly. Yep, exactly. Yeah, they have like bulgur and different kind of legumes and things there too. So, but I'm going to share with you what's known as the Power Nines. Dan Buettner, the guy who did all this research across the globe, he kind of whittled down into 4 main categories and 9 subcategories of what he saw sharing throughout each of these regions. And I've written some notes here myself. So one of, as you can see, right, if you can see what the words are and the colors that are used, the right outlook of things. A lot of these people have purpose. They have a sense of purpose, and they have a lot of positivity. Like he mentioned something about the Okinawans about, a lot of places are going through war-torn histories, but they came out of it with a real positive outlook. Like, I made it. I'm so happy to be here. Let me try to be positive and just put a positive spin and manage my stress in a way like that. The eating wisely, this is a little different region to region too. As you saw, or you might know, right, the Mediterranean diet does promote wine, and he actually lists it here in one of the Power 9 things about having a glass of wine. But the people in Loma Linda do not drink alcohol, so it's not necessarily applicable across all of the regions. The connection part, having that sense of belonging, and of course, to acknowledge and recognize as we age, we might become a little bit more isolated depending on our family, our friends, people who move away, people who are not living as long as we are. Some of our social circles diminish, and maybe even the location in which you are physically doesn't necessarily lend to a social environment. So they've decided to create, senses of belonging and support and putting their loved ones first. So the last thing on here is movement, physical activity in a natural way. And I'll share a little bit more about that too. So I'm just reading off of what you're kind of seeing here, but I'm going to go through some of the notes that I made to give you my take on this also. So when it comes to the outlook of life, like I was mentioning, that was one of the things that I thought for myself too. Like, I try to lead and live with compassion. I try to do things of service. Like, yeah, I'm happy to make a paycheck, but I also want to make sure that I'm doing things that support my mission and my vision and my values. So having that right outlook, but I also know I can get caught up in the negativity things. I can kind of, go down a spiral and just complain. And there's weeks on end where I'm like, why this and why me? And I'm stretched too thin and I hate this. And I really, I don't want to wait for January to do like a whole New Year's resolution. I want to start today to clean up my language about that, to try to focus on the positive aspects, to have more gratitude for things and really place a sense of positivity, to be able to also put space between things, like not to let things fester so much. So that's going to be where I'm going with that. So as I'm sharing with you some of my notes, maybe you can have a sense of what things that you might want to implement there too. The eating wisely. So now this is again, when you look at the American diet, back in the 80s, we had a very of a surplus, a big high amount of food being supplied to us. So the way to get rid of that was to sell us large portions and high quantity of things. So, on average, when we use a standard American diet, we say about 2,000 calories per day, as an example. But Americans are really eating about like 1.5 to 2 times as much of that because of the sense of portions and also the lack of satisfaction. So the thing I wanted to share about that in relationship to some of this like plant-based focus, and also by the way, right? So Italy is making, and a lot of these other places are making grain-based dishes. Americans are so anti-carbohydrates. We're so scared of foods like pasta and rice, etc. But you're looking at it from a standpoint in the rest of the globe that it's filling, it's hearty, it's fibrous, it's whole grains. They're creating things that are going to be hearty, and it gives them a sense of satiety, of fullness too. So we don't love that here. We eat fiber-based foods and we're like, oh, my tummy feels really bloated, or I can't fit in my pants. They look at it as a way of slowing down their eating habits. They're able to satiate themselves. They're able to be full on something that doesn't have a lot of calories. So think of when you go out to eat, or if you're making yourself a meal, how quickly you eat through things. They slow down and they eat things more mindfully. They also some of them base their intake on this 80% rule, as you can see on the bottom there, where they monitor their fullness too. So they kind of step away from the table when they're just about, I'm good. I think I can stop right now and walk away. They allow themselves to be a little hungry. You'll see in the coming slides, and also next month, I'm going to talk about mindfulness and appetites and stuff. Not always very easy as we get older to kind of recognize those hunger fullness cues. So I just want to at least acknowledge that that might not be applicable to everybody to be able to say I can step away when I know I'm full. The next thing around connection. So they love, they dance, they live with joy. They, again, prioritize people in their lives that sometimes we don't, we're too busy. We can't keep in touch with people, or vice versa. Who's keeping in touch with me when I'm getting older? My niece and nephew, I don't see them as it is. And then as I age and maybe they move away or go to someplace in college or whatever, we might be missing those familial circles or those familial ties. And that's something that is unfortunate too. But they try to maintain a sense of connection. The thing that got me emotional about this too was uh, the language that I hear in my circles. It's not my problem, right? It's not why my taxes paying for something that I'm not using. The way that these people live is, what can I do? How can I contribute? How can I support that? Because I want you to benefit from this, not just me. Or maybe I don't even benefit, but just knowing that you do brings me joy and brings me happiness. And how lovely for all of us to treat each other in that kind of approach, in that equal space. The physical activity thing I found so fascinating, because we really do in America, right? We have this whole like no pain, no gain approach to things. Like a lot of people I work with, just they don't prioritize movement, and we become very sedentary. As I mentioned earlier on, some of the things that allowed us to live longer with science and technology is causing us to be more sedentary, is not allowing us to move more naturally. Like we have a lot of convenience things. The things that I noticed in the blue zones is they're using things in a very traditional way. They're rolling out dough and they're making their own wine, and they're not doing anything that is convenient. It is very time consuming, but in doing so, they're tidying up their home. And also because, as you saw too, with the terrain of where they're living, they're walking up many, many flights of stairs, rocky soil or cobblestone streets. And in doing so, they're allowing themselves to build muscles, because a lot of our conversations in the past too, when it comes to aging, we've talked about, naturally speaking, we lose muscle mass. That's just a part of naturally aging. So we try to promote strength training, weightlifting, eating protein to maintain our muscle mass, they're out there tilling the soil and rolling out dough. And even if they don't physically look quote unquote fit, they are rock solid with a lot of the stuff that they're doing. They're also bending down and getting up, gardening and pulling weeds out. Um, Crouching down, right? They're performing squats without even know that they're performing squats. So all of these things are really helping to contribute to their stability. A lot of things that we see in the older adult population is we're more at risk for falls and fractures because of balance issues. We're not stable. And by them moving around on rocky terrain or standing up and sitting down and putting their bodies in all these different positions, they're actually strengthening their inner core and never going to a gym once. So here's another way that I think I'm going to try to observe or change my approach to physical activity. Cardio stuff. I want to really make sure I give myself props for how much I do walk. I want to, if I can't lift weights over my head, but I can say, well, I've been vacuuming all day. That just built up this whole muscle. I want to really make sure I'm giving myself props for all that. The other things too that I mentioned around like the wine discussion, so they're creating things from scratch. They're naturally fermenting, and their grapes are from like generations on end. So again, it's very like seasonal, very local stuff. They're not doing a lot of things to extend shelf life. They're once it's done, it's done. Once it's expired, it's gone. So they're not purposely putting those things into like additives into their foods. And again, that takes a lot of time to create things from scratch, which we not necessarily don't have the luxury to do. They create medicinal properties out of what their food is versus just shoving food in their mouths to grab and go. I see something in the chat, which I'll acknowledge in a second. I've also noticed they're very self-sufficient. They're very resourceful. The open space and the quote unquote like geographical isolation isn't necessarily social isolation. That terrain, they also use a lot of herbs, spices, herbal teas. These are, if you remember from the inflammation webinar, these are anti-inflammatories to help offset any of those potential risk factors too. So is this realistic for us? Are we all gonna grab a plane ticket and head out to Nicoya, Costa Rica, or Okinawa? I don't know. And I'm gonna share with you on the following slides a few things that I just want to recognize about that. Yeah, exactly, Donna. It's not that they don't have it. Like certain places they do have livestock and dairy, but and tomatoes too. So like in Italy, that's a staple food that they use because they use a lot of pasta and sauces, and they also fry things. So that was something I thought was cool too, is again, I'm from with the stuff that I hear now where people are like no fat, no fried foods, etc. It increases your risk for heart disease. They're out there frying stuff left and right because that's just how they eat. But it's really a combination of all these factors. So I don't necessarily think they don't have the dairy, but they have more of a focus on the plants versus the animals, and dairy would be an animal food. But I do know in places like Italy and in Greece, like they use a lot of feta and sheep and goat milk and things like that. So thank you for your observation for that. I appreciate that. All right, so let's take a look. Again, I want to recognize how I'm good on time. Yeah, I want to recognize and acknowledge that sometimes it's easier said than done. So I'm also going to give you a little sneak peek at some things that might be coming up in future webinars. When we are born, we have an innate ability to regulate our intake, right? We cry when we're hungry, we spit up when we're full. As our life progresses, there's a lot of external factors. There's a lot of relationship issues with food, body image, language that's used about, negative discussions. We start putting morality. I'm bad, I'm good, I feel guilty. All of these things play a role in how we end up eating. Physically speaking, as we age, we might be suffering from chronic conditions that just don't make us feel good. We might be put on a ton of medicine that interact with things. And now we don't know when we're hungry, when we're full. The appetite cues lessen, weaken as we age, as do our olfactory senses. So we can't smell and taste certain things like we used to. So we're sitting there pouring a bunch of salt and trying to make things taste better, or just eating and being like, I hate everything. This is not palatable to me whatsoever. So one of the things I want to share with you here, I'm not going too much into detail in this. I'll do this next month when we talk about mental health and mindfulness and eating habits, is about reestablishing our recognition, like that 80% rule that I just mentioned before, of allowing us to accept the foods, being comfortable, making choices, relaxing, taking time. Again, is this realistic? Who's to say? You can share feedback with me when we go deeper into this discussion next month. But we're going to talk a little bit about that too, because I just want to acknowledge it's not always easy. I might have shared my mom's 88, 89. She sets timers because she will go the whole day and like forget to eat because her body is not telling her you're hungry, you're full. And she'll prepare for herself a particular portion to allow herself to eat it, and she'll eat it, but she doesn't necessarily have those cues. So again, think of who you are, the different factors that you're going through in that too, what you think, does create good habits for you, or what you might need to modify if you're able to do so. And we'll talk a little bit about that next month. If you remember the discussion in the dining out webinar that we had a few months ago, we did talk about the food safety components of things too. So again, here I'm acknowledging as we age, we just naturally become more immunocompromised. We have to be careful about foodborne illnesses. So the people who are living across the globe and making their own food and storing it in their, basement with underneath the bricks and stuff, they don't necessarily have to worry about this stuff because they're using what they have immediately. They're not buying a lot of convenience foods. They're not buying in bulk because things are on sale. We have to be careful about how we separate, cross-contaminate, store things, refrigerate, toss things out. So again, I'm just acknowledging some like realistic factors to us versus them, if you will. And then last but not least, again, taking into account what I said in the beginning of this presentation about access to high quality healthcare or access to any kind of services, screenings and recommendations about your healthcare management as we age changes too. So wherever you are in life, as we're getting older, we still want to make sure we're going to our physical exams, especially oral and eye exams can be very helpful because oral health has to do a lot with heart health. Eye exams to make sure you can see where you're going and that you're not accidentally picking things up and getting into unfortunate situations in your home if you can't see or walk in places. Colonoscopies, mammograms, bone density tests, again, making sure we're maintaining our overall body composition, not just focus on weight all the time, but what's going on underneath all of this too, these other things that happen too. So they didn't necessarily mention these things in the blue zone discussions. And I just wanted to kind of bring that back to say, please make sure you're also doing what you can if you have not set up a screening or a follow-up visit with your doctor, or talk with your doctor about what needs to be done in the years to come. All right, and that brings me to, as always with these webinars, I ask about like your next steps. Like, what do you think you might want to do, not do, or keep doing? Is anything that I shared with you today something that you're like, I really need to kind of consider that? Like me, right? I went through a whole that took me for a very emotional roller coaster when I was looking and watching through all these things. So there's definitely things that I'm going to start doing and definitely things I'm going to try to stop doing. And then what are things that are working for you right now that you think are okay? Like I'm going to keep doing them. And how do you prioritize to make sure you're being consistent at that? Because that is a big thing too. Like Matthew and I were talking about before we hit record here, that there's just some things you just can't keep up with all the time. So how do we try to reprioritize all that stuff to